Hello, I'm Ron Pisaneski, Idaho Public Television General Manager. Welcome to tonight's virtual event, Idaho's Hemingway, from our series, Idaho Experience. Everyone knows that Ernest Hemingway spent his final days in Idaho and took his own life at his home in Ketchum. But Hemingway's time here in Idaho is much deeper and more complex. And our latest Idaho Experience episode explores Hemingway's time in Idaho in all its wonderful richness, and also examines his legacy on Idaho today. The Community Library of Ketchum is the custodian of the Hemingway House and our partner in bringing you tonight's virtual event. Tonight's conversation and our Idaho Experience program is leading up to the broadcast premiere of Hemingway, a 3-part documentary by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick. This 6-hour series will air on Idaho Public Television April 5th, 6th, and 7th. The film examines the visionary work and the turbulent life of Ernest Hemingway, one of the greatest and most influential writers America has ever produced. For tonight's look at Idaho's Hemingway, I'm pleased to welcome tonight's special guests. Jenny Emery Davidson is the Executive Director of the Community Library and a board member of the Friends of Idaho Public Television. Richard Blanco is the 5th presidential inaugural poet in U.S. history. He also was the Community Library's 2020 Hemingway Distinguished Lecturer and Writer-in-Residence. Author Stacy Gwill is a 25-year resident of Boise and a distinguished scholar on Ernest Hemingway. Moderating tonight's discussion is Idaho Public Television producer Bill Manny, who led the production of Idaho Experience's episode, Idaho's Hemingway. Idaho Public Television's mission is to harness the power of public media to encourage lifelong learning, connect our communities, and enrich the lives of all Idahoans. We tell Idaho stories. And that's why we're here tonight at this virtual event, to connect and engage during this time when we can't be together face to face. So thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoy tonight's featured clips and conversation. Bill?
Thank you, Ron, and welcome to everybody joining us for this conversation about Hemingway in Idaho. I am Bill Manny. I'm a producer at Idaho Public Television, and I had the pleasure of working on this documentary, including interviewing the 3 panelists we have with us tonight. The format for this conversation is going to be pretty simple and straightforward, and we want to invite you to participate. So if you go to the chat queue on this webinar, you can post your questions for our panelists, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions tonight as possible. So I want to welcome our 3 panelists. We have Richard Blanco, who's joining us from his home in Maine. We have Stacy Gwill from her home in Boise, and we have Jenny Emery Davidson from the Community Library in Ketchum. So thank you all 3 for making time for us tonight.
Thank you, Bill. Great to be here.
So I'll get started with a question. There is so much we know about Ernest Hemingway, what he wrote and what's been written about him, and yet Hemingway still seems to be revealed. Something new every year. Every scholar finds something new. So if there's something you could share with our audience, one important thing you know about Hemingway, or something that's surprising, or something important about his time in Idaho, what would that be? And I think I'll start with Stacy, and then go to Jenny, and then go to Richard.
Well, thank you, Manny. It's so great to be here and with everyone. I came across something interesting that has to do with Hemingway and Idaho. I was going through a book called High in the Wild by Lloyd Arnold, as a friend of Hemingway's. And he talks about when Hemingway got to Sun Valley and he was working on the novel, they took a ride up into the hills, up to Adams Gulch. And Hemingway looked out over that landscape and he said, "Oh, this is El Sordo country. This is what I'm writing about. This is where they're going to blow the bridge." And so apparently they went 3 or 4 more times that fall. And at one point, Hemingway said to Arnold, he said, "You know, if they make a film out of this work I'm doing, I'd like it to be filmed here." And so he asked Arnold to take pictures, especially in the spring, where maybe there was some snow on the ground, which has to do with one of the scenes in the film, in the novel. And He did 50 of them for Hemingway. And unfortunately, the film was not made in Idaho because it was filmed during World War II and was filmed in the Sierras. But I think it's wonderful to know that Hemingway, this film that was being made of Hemingway's wonderful work that he was so proud of, that he wanted it to be filmed in our Idaho. So I thought that was a great part to know.
Richard, how about you and your time you spent here in the summer?
Sure. Well, I would say not being a Hemingway scholar, as Stacy is, but I would say Idaho itself was a surprise in some ways. I mean, I had been to Hemingway's home in Cuba. I had been to Hemingway's home in Key West. And so, there's all, so tourists, it's full of tourists and sort of, this is what you know most, what most people know about Hemingway and Sloppy Joe's and then the Cuba thing. And it was just so surprising to me, at least, Idaho? Wait a minute. Nobody told me that in high school, right? And to really feel that this was a home for Hemingway, that this was a place almost not a secret, certainly wasn't a secret, but it was something that even when you go now to the house, it feels like a home. It doesn't feel like these other places. And just the idea that Idaho in general was, I mean, again, from spending time there, I can see why now, right? Was something he relied on, something that something kept checking back into, right? Something that was in some ways a kind of a rudder or a grounding for him. And certainly that's not the Hemingway on the billboards, so to speak. And that was for me an incredible and wonderful surprise to see that here's this real person in a real home in a real setting that mattered.
Jenny?
Well, Bill, and this is why I'm so glad for the Idaho Public Television program, Idaho's Hemingway, because I think that remarkably, as much as Hemingway and his work has been studied over the decades now, for really a century, his time in the American West remains largely unexplored. And that in itself, as Richard was describing, it is kind of a secret. It's an open secret. There's really no reason for it to be a secret. But, I grew up in Twin Falls, just 70 miles south from where Hemingway spent so much time and where he died and where his widow, Mary Welsh Hemingway, continued to live for another 25 years after his death. And I remember Mrs. Berry in my English class at Twin Falls High School mentioning it once, but it was very much off my radar. And yet, we think so strongly of Hemingway and Paris, or Hemingway and even Africa, where he went on some significant safaris there, but he kept returning to Idaho for 22 years. He wrote significant parts of A Farewell to Arms in Wyoming. He saved his wife Mary's life in Wyoming when she was had a severe episode when she had an ectopic pregnancy. The American West is a big part of his life, and yet in the studies of him, it has remained largely unexplored. And so I think in some ways that is exciting for us to still have that terrain to dig into him and to think about his time in Idaho as perhaps revealing other aspects of a complex man who wrote complex works. So I would say Idaho itself is remains a kind of secret, a kind of uncharted terrain in Hemingway studies.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good answers, all of you. Thank you. That's thought-provoking. Jenny, why don't you kind of piggyback on that and tell us a little bit about, how he ended up in Idaho and how he ended up in that house and how the house then became your responsibility.
Mm-hmm. So Hemingway first came to Idaho, to the Sun Valley area, in the fall of 1939. and he had been invited by Union Pacific Railroad and Sun Valley. Sun Valley Resort was a nascent resort at that point in time, just a couple of years old. And their publicity plan was to invite luminaries there. And who better than Ernest Hemingway, who was also a spokesperson for Abercrombie and Fitch. He was at his prime at this time, about 40 years old. He had published The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms. He's working on For Whom the Bell Tolls. I mean, he had hit his stride as a public figure and as a writer. And so, of course, Sun Valley wanted him to come. As best we can understand, he never formally accepted the invitation. He just showed up after what must have been a fascinating family vacation with Pauline Pfeiffer and his 3 sons in Wyoming. That vacation ends with Pauline and the boys heading back to Florida, and he continues on with Martha Gellhorn, who is not yet, but will soon become his 3rd wife, to check out this place, Sun Valley. So they drive here, show up late one evening when the lodge has largely been closed down for a season, and they set up shop in room 206 in the lodge and really become a part of the community while they're here. He does the photographs, but really he's hanging out with the people at Sun Valley and working on For Whom the Bell Tolls. And that begins a pattern of him coming back most often in the fall, most often for several months at a time, really for the rest of his life until his death here in July of 1961. After he died, his widow, Mary Hemingway, you can imagine she had options at that point, right? She could have chosen to leave. I mean, her husband had just died here. And one way to deal with that grief could be to leave this place altogether. But instead, she really settled in even more deeply and maintained her home in Idaho, where she said she had more friends per square mile than any place else in the world. And she maintained her residence here until her own death in 1986, splitting her time between here and New York. She bequeathed the house to the Nature Conservancy. Ernest's son, Jack Hemingway, had been very involved with the Nature Conservancy and protecting Silver Creek Preserve. Jack Hemingway had served on the Idaho Fish and Game Commission. And Mary said that she wanted the house to be protected as a nature reference library. So the Nature Conservancy was the custodian of the house for 25 years. And because they recognized that it was a challenge with their mission as a nonprofit organization to devote the resources, the historic preservation work that the house warranted to it, they embarked on a master planning process with the community library that led to the transition of the house to the library's ownership and operation. Which has proved to be a wonderful alignment with the library's mission. And we also have Ernest's library card in our collection from 1957. So it feels somehow very natural to us to be the custodian of his home now.
So no bragging tonight, Jenny. I'm sorry. I want to remind our audience that if you have a question for us, add it in the chat and we'll get to those in a little bit. For right now, we're going to watch a clip about some of the objects that remain in that house to this day. So I'm going to have our panelists turn off their cameras and we're going to play this clip. It's about a little over 2 minutes.
Hemingway was already famous when he came to Idaho in 1939 to lend his celebrity to the new Sun Valley ski resort.
He was invited, as you know, many celebrities were invited by Union Pacific, who owned Sun Valley Resort, and they were trying to create a glamorous destination that would attract people who wanted to be around glamour.
Hemingway would return, usually to hunt birds in the fall, for the next 2 decades. He bought a furnished home along the Big Wood River in 1959. Hemingway homes in Cuba and Key West, Illinois, even Arkansas, are museums today. The Ketchum home is instead a haven for writers and researchers, and it remains largely as it was when Mary and Ernest Hemingway lived there. They're everyday objects alongside art that reflects the most important friendships and influences.
Something that we find really touching about the collection of objects that this house holds is how a lot of them seem to have been treated with a degree of familiarity. You know, these things like the watercolor by Dorothy Shakespeare, the paintings by Waldo Pierce that remain unframed, like the books inscribed by Archibald MacLeish and Thornton Wilder that are just set on the shelf. These are things that he carried with him from Paris to Key West to Cuba to Ketchum. And so they really seem to bear witness to the friendships, the relationships that he held close.
When he killed himself here in July 1961, Hemingway was at work on the book that would become A Movable Feast. The title references holidays or feast days that move on the calendar.
The title of A Movable Feast, which is drawn from Hemingway saying, if you're lucky enough to live in Paris as a young man, then wherever you go, it will stay with you because Paris is a movable feast. And the fact that he's at the end of his life, but he's in that home in Idaho, and he's thinking back on those days in Paris, the movable feast stayed with him. Those days when he was forming his art. When you think about the Cézanne and the Miro and Pierce, which is, of course, the bullfights, again, in the 20s. They all sort of connect, don't they? They all tell that narrative of him.
So I really liked, Stacy, how you phrased that what's left in that house kind of helps tell the narrative of Hemingway. And
Yeah.
in fact, Hemingway said when he wrote that he wanted you to feel more than you could understand about his writing. And sometimes I think that's the way that house communicates. We feel more than we understand. But what do you take away? What about his narrative does the house tell you?
I feel like that the artifacts in that house tell such a rich narrative of Hemingway. I think, when you first come in and you see, for instance, the bookshelves are stuffed with books. And of course, some of them were most likely Mary's, but it attests to the fact that he was, a voracious reader, and he had 3 books at one time that he was reading, and trunks of books that came with him when he traveled. And he read every genre and every subject. He even borrowed a book from about the Encyclopedia of Idaho when he was there. And he believed that you learned more from reading writers. You can learn more about how to write by reading other writers. So you have that. Then you have the animal mounts, which we think, again, you think of his love of hunting and his trips to Africa, which brought us some interesting short stories out of that. But I also think it attests to his a love of, and he understood the natural world and how much he brought it into his writings and how much we benefit from his knowledge of the natural world. I think of some of the passages, for instance, in Green Hills of Africa, when he can describe one single animal in one line and get the essential out of it. So you have that. And then, of course, the artwork. He was a lover of art, a collector of art. So many of his friends were artists. And again, as we learn, he learned from Cézanne about how to do his landscapes. So you have that. But I think the thing that really rounds out the narrative for me is you going up of those steps in the house, and you peer into this small room on the right that he apparently slept in some of the time. And you see that typewriter on the top of that desk and the landscape that he would look out of. And yes, that was where he just struggled mightily to finish the finishing parts on A Movable Feast, his last professional writing. But I see it also as the other role that Hemingway played, and that's the role of the solitary writer. I mean, all that life that he had, more things than anybody could do in a lifetime, but they had to come and happen on the page. They had to be brought to life on the page. And that doesn't happen unless you're in a solitary bedroom by yourself, or in a tent in Africa, or, you know, in a rented room in Cuba. That's where that life comes to life for us. And so that's how I feel when I looked in that room. I thought, no, this is the circular part of this narrative that's in that house. This is where and how they came to life, and how much he was dedicated to his craft, and how much work that was, that we don't always think about that part.
Right. Right.
So that's the rich narrative that is in that home.
A lot of the writers, and I'll ask Richard to expand on this, but a lot of the writers who spend time in that house come away really impressed with the lesson of Hemingway's discipline and commitment
Yes.
to craft.
Yes.
And Richard, you know, Hemingway did say that he wanted us to feel more than we understand, and he made much of his theory of omission. Right, you leave out everything that's not absolutely essential. And that sounds almost like poetry, not prose. And so, how do you think of Hemingway as prose versus the poetry that's in that work?
Yeah. Well, I think certainly that kind of spare prose, that kind of bare bones, is certainly starts to parallel poetry in many ways. I'm thinking of also, to paraphrase Elizabeth Bishop, that said something to the effect of, what's left out of a poem is more important than what's in the poem.
That's very Hemingway-esque, isn't it?
Very.
And I think how that dynamic works, and how it also parallels poetry, not only in terms of craft, but how the craft affects the reader, is that when there's things left out, you're also ironically, you're in some ways brought in more, because you're allowed to bring your experience and your imagination onto the page. It's kind of like what poets also do. They just leave enough space in there. But also that it's emotion driven is very important too. You know, a lot of fiction is just, you know, plot, 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 plot story. And not so, and poetry is more emotion driven. Even a narrative poem is emotion driven by emotion, more like song, in the ways that we understand something without necessarily being able to articulate it, without being able to put our finger on it. And certainly, I think Hemingway's work starts becoming like that, like poetry in that way. That there are impressions that we get and we can sit with for hours, just like a poem. And we may never get to that, or means exactly this. That's not the point, right? It lives in us viscerally like a poem. And one more thing that I've thought about that as well, while I was at the house, actually, was, and I don't know if I just thought of it or read it somewhere in one of the books lying around, but it was interesting, especially in Old Man in the Sea, that you're not, as a fiction writer, you're not supposed to, you know, invest yourself in the characters in a way that, and yet in a way that some of the characters are infused in a way that they almost become part of the psyche or a poetic persona of Hemingway himself, sort of trying to work something out. And that fine balance, which is what you try to do in a poem too. You are the poet, but you're also your own persona in the poem. That is very poetic as well.
I like that. I have not heard anybody articulate it quite that way. We have a clip about that talks about some of the writers in residence there. So why don't we show that now, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more. So we'll shut off our cameras and watch this clip.
Library leaders see the Hemingway legacy, and now the Hemingway House, as a way to promote not just Hemingway's contributions, but the broader literary culture of Idaho.
I think it's really significant that Idaho was a creative space for him. And I think because he continues to be such an iconic figure, that he provides an invitation for us to think about how Idaho can be a creative space, has been and can be, for lots of different people.
The centerpiece of this larger literary effort is an artist-in-residence program that hosts writers for extended stays in a new basement apartment at the Hemingway home. The first dozen resident artists have spent their time writing, thinking, and participating in community library events. Richard Blanco, President Obama's 2013 inaugural poet, hosted workshops for aspiring writers at the Hemingway House. The weeks Blanco spent at the house gave him insight into Hemingway's life and mental decline, and his struggles after depression and alcoholism and electroshock therapy left him all but unable to write.
It became much more real to me in that respect. Something about how terrifying, it was for him to sit down or stand up to write, that he would just tell himself, I just want to write one true sentence today, just one true sentence. And God, could I relate to that? And the terror of it too, so hey, if Hemingway was scared, I can be scared too.
Actor, film writer, and producer Naomi McDougall-Jones and her husband moved to Ketchum in 2020 after falling in love with Central Idaho during her Hemingway residency.
You know, Idaho is beautiful, and I think there's something really to be said for being an artist in a place that fills you up and does give you inspiration and creativity and space. I think that's a lesson of Hemingway. You know, he did that. He constructed his life so that he would be in places that gave him artistic nourishment.
So let me piggyback on that, Richard. The time you spent there, I think you were surprised also to learn just about the state of Hemingway at the end of his life. You know, it's not something that we really know well, and gave you a new appreciation for kind of what it was like for him to struggle to create. Can you talk about that?
Sure. It happened actually. There's some photos that are a part of the artifacts in the house, and of course, you're used to seeing the photos of Hemingway. The macho or the hunting photos, and these were the photos later in his life, and also learning a lot of the history of him in the latter years in Idaho. And just for the first time, Hemingway, like I said, becoming real, and that stereotype of the bon vivant and the macho and the hunter, that although that was true, that there was a terrified person in the world like all of us, like not just writers, that there was like real human beings sort of struggling with the big questions of life, and in his case the shadow of his mental health that was over him all his life. And understanding something in our, I made this connection. I don't know. I'm not a Hemingway scholar, but there's this interesting connection that I found as him as an artist, and that balance of being out there, being that adventurer, and then this quiet solitude and this sort of quiet despair that was going on as well, and that living in that shadow of again his mental health, that one feels most alive in nature, right? In natural surroundings, and one feels most alive when you are closest to death in some ways, when you are risking things. So the idea that there was these connections are actually what fed him and kept him sustained in a way to be able to write and go into those places and go into what writing demands of you, which is just blood, sweat, and tears. That balance was able, those two counter forces. I don't think he was just hunting for the sake of hunting. In some ways, I think it was just essential to be able to have that counterbalance. Mm-hmm. And nature as well. And I can see that in Idaho, like who could not, you need that replenishment in some ways.
Jenny too had talked about the importance of the natural world to Hemingway, and in fact, she moderated a discussion with Ken Burns and the production team on that very theme in Hemingway's life, and was a fascinating discussion. And I think people can still view that online if they're interested, right, Jenny? We have a question from somebody watching from Maine, Richard, and it's on this theme, so I'm going to read it to you. It says, Maine and Idaho both produce, it's from Robert in Maine. Maine and Idaho both produce great writers and poets. How did your time in Idaho's natural environment influence your approach to writing and perhaps specific subject matter? So he's asking you that specifically, Richard. So did you come out of your experience inspired on anything specifically?
Yes, very much. And of course, things that are still rippling through me right now. But serendipitously, I was working on a memoir about a cousin of mine in Cuba who died by suicide. And I had just started that project, not thinking, oh my God, wait, I am in Hemingway's house. But besides that, I think there was something else that got it. The ripple went even further. I'm 53 now, and I'm starting to go through kind of like that questioning, well, let's face it, midlife crisis. And rather than buying a Corvette, I'm going to write another book of poetry. But I'm also thinking in two things: Hemingway's life and connection to nature. I'm thinking how nature is our ultimate home, our universal home, our ultimate resting place as well. I'm trying to explore all these connections that are happening with just questioning basically my own mortality, and through the poetry, and being there, of course, and seeing Hemingway and witnessing his life, and again his own mortality, his own struggles with those questions in his life, I think is echoing in me still. And I think I wrote a poem while I was there, which I think is exactly that. And I think that poem started this whole like, it's actually, I'll give it away. The working title is where where to choose to die.
Oh, gosh.
What is your resting place, right? What is that ultimate home that we feel in our hearts?
Well, I know that, Richard, that you did a reading of that poem for the community library, and it's available on their website. And there's actually a link to you reading that poem on the Hemingway page at Idaho Public TV. So we urge people to go check that out and see you doing that. There's kind of a related question about the natural world that came in from Lori, who asked, and I'll ask you, Jenny, to address this first, because I think it's a fairly simple answer, but maybe we can answer why this is so simple. What is the quintessential Idaho novel or work that Hemingway wrote? And so the short answer is he didn't. But maybe you could talk about it, and then maybe Stacy could also amplify, why isn't there a great Idaho novel in the Hemingway, canon?
The one piece, well, there are two pieces really that Hemingway wrote about Idaho, and one he wrote, Stacy, maybe you know the date of it specifically. It's called The Shot, and it describes him hunting in the Pissimiroy Valley, hunting for pronghorn antelope, getting in a fight in the bar in May, Idaho. It's not one of his greatest works. It was published in, I think, True magazine.
Yeah.
But the first piece of writing, and I think the most Idaho piece of writing that he wrote that really is about this locale, had a very small circulation, and it's a eulogy. And I think that is really profound, that his one piece of Idaho writing is a eulogy. And I think that ties to what Richard was just saying of, this question of where do we come to rest? And what does it mean to come to rest? And when Hemingway was here that very first time in 1939, he is writing For Whom the Bell Tolls, in which the main character is about the same age as Hemingway was at that time. It's a man, Robert Jordan, from Montana, from the American West, who reflects on his father dying by suicide, by gun, and anticipating his own death in a war situation. So Hemingway, at age 41, first trip to Idaho, is grappling with mortality. And then some 6 weeks into that very first visit, someone he had just met but had become fast friends with, Jean Van Gilder, who had been born in Twin Falls and then lived in Chicago for a while and came back to Idaho and was working as a publicist and an outdoor guide for Sun Valley. Jean Van Gilder dies in a hunting accident on the Snake River, hunting ducks. And his widow asks Hemingway to write the eulogy. So Hemingway writes this eulogy for a man that he had just been coming to know. And it is this beautiful piece of writing. You can read it online. You can read it in Lloyd Arnold's book, High on the Wild. But you really, in reading that eulogy, I have the feeling that Hemingway is imagining a version of himself. And it is very much describing Jean Van Gilder in the natural landscape of the American West. And that's where that line, best of all, he loved the fall, comes from. That's not about Hemingway. That's Hemingway writing about someone else, but perhaps a man he wanted to be. So the fact that 22 years later, there would be a eulogy for Hemingway in this same place it's uncanny. Um, but I appreciate that question very much because I think it is so poignant, so significant that while Idaho really seemed to provide the creative space, the physical distancing that allowed him to write about Spain, about Paris, about other places. The one thing he wrote here was a eulogy in which he was really confronting mortality with an immediacy, an emergency, an urgency, and a tenderness that is deep.
Hmm. Hmm. Anything to add to that, Stacy?
Only that I know that I feel like the reason he didn't write about Idaho as much in his time as Idaho is because he so respected these people that he was around. He called them his family, and I think he just wanted to protect his family like anyone would. Like, I'm just not going to write about my family. That's who his family was. That's why he kept coming back, and he respected them so much. And I know in the one story that we're talking about, The Shot, it was written, I think it published in 51, but it was about a hunt in 41. But the one part of that hunt, it talks about, Lloyd Arnold talks about, there was an antelope hunt, and Hemingway was able to, things got kind of messed up, and then he was able to just grab the shotgun and get the antelope in the right place. And he earned the respect of those hunters that he was with. And that's probably the best part that I got, because Jenny's right, it's not his best work, but he really wanted the respect of those people. Hemingway always respected people that had the real code that he believed in. And so I think that's why he hasn't. But I know his son wrote at one point, if you want to know what Hemingway thought about the West, read what he wrote about it. And then the other one story that comes up is Wine of Wyoming, which is the only other really Western story. And that's a fascinating story too. But basically, I think it's just protecting that family that he never really wanted to get that out.
If I may add something to both that, yes, when I was in residency, Jenny gave me that eulogy, and I think that was such a moving piece.
It's so moving.
That started me in this ripple that we're talking about. And also, Stacy, as a writer, I'm thinking that word respect is it's really interesting, because I think sometimes when you write about something, it demystifies it. It just,
Yes.
It becomes something in a book.
Yes.
And I'm thinking right now, like, that maybe that's partly why that respect of just having this place that wasn't in a way mired by imagination, or like you said, like bringing characters in there that might be related to townsfolk and all this stuff. It gave it that respect so that it would always remain pure, if you will, in a way.
I agree.
Right.
Yes.
Well, Phil Huss in our documentary talks a little bit about that and kind of articulates the theory. And so for viewers who haven't seen the whole film, they can watch it. They can stream it at idahoptv.org and see that part for itself. Speaking of the documentary, we are going to show a clip about the influence of the various artists on Hemingway. And so let's play that clip now, and then we'll talk to Stacy and the rest of you a little bit about how artists and art influenced Hemingway's writing. So we're gonna turn off our cameras and watch that clip.
Hemingway studied many artists. He said he learned the power of repetition by listening to Bach. But the biggest influence was Paul Cézanne.
He wanted to write about country so that it would be there, like Cézanne had done it in painting. He felt almost holy about it. Ernest Hemingway.
He once said, if I could be anything except a writer, I would want to be a painter. He was able to draw from art as he was first coming up with his own language, his own way he wanted to write. Well, here he is, a young man walking through the museums and thinking about how he wants to add dimensions to his story. And he tells Gertrude Stein, I want to write landscapes like Cézanne, and eventually did.
This print, taped to the closet in Idaho, is not just any Cézanne. It is of Mont Sainte-Victoire, one of a series that Hemingway would have seen in the 1920s in Paris museums and in the Paris home of his mentor, Gertrude Stein. From Cézanne, Hemingway learned to break down form in his prose, play with depth and focus, color and light.
Cézanne came up with, his theory of, I'm going to make the background just as powerful with saturation of color and light and whatever. And I want to reproduce what really happens, what you really experience when you're experiencing a grand vista. In a Cézanne, you're moving back and forth. If you read, like, say, the first paragraph of For Whom the Bell Tolls, and you watch how Hemingway will describe the foreground, the middle ground, and the background, he will move into the landscape and back. And it's fascinating. Once you are aware of that, you see that almost every time he does a grand vista.
So that clip talked about, the really pivotal influence Cézanne had on Hemingway, Stacy, but you were talking the other day about how we know that it was more than just Cézanne that influenced Hemingway's thinking, including some of the very art that he has in that house. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yes, of course. There's a lot of interconnections in that house, a web of connections of the art, and all of it connected to Hemingway as he was learning to write. But Miro is probably one of the more interesting ones. Miro's The Farm, which is one of the first pieces of art he was able to buy, and he gave it as a birthday present to his wife Hadley for her 34th birthday. And it eventually became one of his most prized possessions. It has a whole nother story to itself. But people have compared The Farm, which of course Hemingway hung over his bedroom and had with the rest of his life, to that Miro and Hemingway were both trying to reduce to the essential objects and places and people, reduced to their essentialness. And you see that in both of those if you really compare the objects in that Miro Farm. So that's a big influence on him. And the connections in the house, I keep connecting more and more. But I would say that having his friends as artists and collecting art and studying art all came together as he was learning his art. And one of the just sidelights of the art in that house is you have Miro, and you have Hemingway, and then you have this little tiny print of Picasso that was actually on a postcard that Mary had. And it wasn't anything Hemingway put there, but it's really important in the sense that Miro and Picasso and Hemingway all supported the Spanish Republican government as they were trying to fight off fascism in the Spanish Civil War. And all three of them contributed time and effort, but also artwork at the Spanish Pavilion. They were all there together, and to have those pieces there, and they were in the Spanish Pavilion. So there was Picasso's Guernica. There was a huge poster painted by Miro of Catalan Peasant in Revolt. And then on the same floor as Guernica, there was a small theater, and there was a film that Hemingway, a propaganda film he worked on to support the Spanish Republican government, all together. So you just see all these connections and all the influences that I think that they actually had on each other.
Interesting. Speaking of the house, we have two people who've written in questions specifically about the house, and they direct them to Jenny and Richard, but I think you could all respond. So I'll read them both, and then you can respond. The Hemingway house has such a quirky design. I can't help wondering what it was like for a writer to write within that decor. So I think to Richard, to you, what does the physical surroundings, the indoor design, and the amazing outdoor landscape, how does that impact the writer. Well, of course, the residence is in the basement, so you're not living in the quirky Hemingway space. But nonetheless, there's that question. And then the other question is to Jenny. What was it? What was your initial reaction when you entered that house, and how did that shape your current vision of how it's being used? So why don't we start with Richard, and then we'll go to Jenny.
Well, no, that's exactly right. Right. There's the apartment downstairs is built and it's luxe. It's totally deluxe. It's a wonderful, amazing space. But and Jenny can speak to it, a lot of thought went into that so that it has the feel of the era, but with like just all the amenities and also some quirky stories that Jen might be able to share. But I would also say that, thank goodness I'm not writing upstairs, because the pressure would be too much. In fact, before I understood how the setup was, I was like, what am I going to do? Like, and I won't be able to write a sentence, not even a syllable, because so it's kind of neat, because you're like, cool, I'm in Hemingway's house, and you love that idea and that spirit, but you also have your very private and a space that becomes yours. And we're there for what, Jenny, like 3 weeks. It really just started becoming yours, and it kind of would go upstairs and sit on the patio and sort of be close to that spirit, but then I was able to have my own private my own private space to write and to think.
So they didn't take you up there to the Hemingway typewriter and say, here, be inspired. Good.
I saw all of it, more than once, but thank goodness.
So Jenny, what was your reaction when you first kind of experienced the house, and how did that influence your vision for it?
Right. Well, and to build on what Richard is saying, we want the writers to be adjacent to the legacy of Hemingway and not feel like they are being overwhelmed by it. And just to speak a little bit to the quirky design of the house, as the Idaho Public Television episode describes, it was constructed by Bob Topping, who was the heir to a tin fortune, and he wanted it to be modeled after the Sun Valley Lodge. So like the Sun Valley Lodge, it is constructed of concrete, and wood forms were used to make it look like wood. And he had the interior design to be very much of the moment, with furnishings from, Los Angeles, mid-century modern. And when the house was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, of course, primarily because of the association with Ernest Hemingway, it was also noted that it is a really tremendous example of mid-century modern design, and particularly for this part of the world. So it is unique design. For me, I think every time I walk into the house, it continues to evolve for me. And I was thinking, as Stacy was talking earlier, about different objects in the house, and the reproductions and originals of different pieces of art that are there, how really the house itself is a place in process. Hemingway only owned that house for the last 2 years of his life, and he and Mary were in the process of making it their final home together. And so you see the things that they were choosing, the books that he specifically selected to be there, the record collection. And of course that continued after his death, but I get the sense of how someone is giving shape to their life as they know they are approaching the end of it. And I think that is what continues to fascinate me about the house, is that sense of process. And that's what we really want to lean into at the library, is that it continues to be a place of process, that house is not a gravestone, that it's a cornerstone for ongoing creative work. When we're able to have a poet of the stature of Richard Blanco come to Central Idaho and deliver a talk and share some of his poetry, and here's just an example of what happens rippling from that event, is a young Latinx woman is moved by his reading of The Complaint of El Rio Grande, one of Richard's beautiful, beautiful poems. And it is one that resonates with her so deeply that later she posts it online herself, reading that poem as part of the Get Out the Vote effort with her own peers. And so we want not only writers to come here and of course be inspired by what we think is a spectacular natural landscape, but for them to feed into the dialogue in our own community in ways that we wouldn't even anticipate. That's the kind of conversation that I think the house, the residency program, and Hemingway's time in Idaho generally um, can nurture.
Mhm. Yes.
So, speaking of the stature of Richard Blanco, um, you had this incredible experience of becoming a thing when President Obama picked you to be his inaugural poet, and now you are joined the ranks of not only Amanda Gorman but Robert Frost and Maya Angelou, and so I think my guess is that gives you a little sense of what it was like to try to be a creative person and an artist working under the burden of celebrity and fame and notoriety and pressure that Ernest Hemingway must have faced. So did you have any sense for what that was like, or an appreciation for what it must have been like to try to be Ernest Hemingway? Because now you have to be Richard Blanco.
Yeah, certainly went through some of that, and this is all, relatively speaking, for a poet, not a novelist. But even, which in a weird way you're even less prepared for, because as a poet you don't expect any fame whatsoever. But certainly two things. Certainly I can see again why Idaho. I can see why the house to be able to get away from all that in a sense. And as I learned, and as we're learning here tonight, with real people that matter, with a community that mattered, with eulogies being written for friends, that was a reality check, a grounding rod. I can see that certainly, but also, something that you would need even more the more famous you get. In a way, there is this kind of, from the outside looking in, you think, oh well, Richard Blanco is in Robert Frost and blah blah blah, and then Ernest Hemingway is hitting his stride right in the 40s, his 40s. But then how do you top yourself, right? Or the idea is that now you can't just publish some little thing in a magazine that you just spit off, over the day. So the pressure to publish well is even more than not being published at all. So I could see why you need even more counterbalance as more and more fame. People are demanding genius from you, and there's always that question: do I have any genius left? Do I have anything else left to give the world? Anything of that? Anything at least remotely good? So I could certainly see that, and I can't imagine what I went through is like this small compared to Hemingway. Let's not compare apples with oranges here. But even at that scale, the last 8 years, I'm still sort of renegotiating my space, and I think that's part of why I ended up loving Idaho. That's part of why I live in Maine and in the woods. That all helps.
Interesting. So you may have thought it was inevitable that we would get a question about, are there any ghost stories connected to the Hemingway house? So do any of you have ghost stories? Richard, did you feel like you were haunted when you were there?
No, I think there's some story about the pipes, but I don't know, Jenny can speak to that. I did feel his presence, but I should say I'm not clairvoyant and I don't see anything. I never see anything, but I do feel things, and it happens in my poetry. And I got to say, if there is such a thing as a ghost, at least the spirit of him to me started speaking in the river, in the gurgles of the river behind the house. And of course, that's what ended up becoming the poem. But that's how I was communicating with him, through that sound, there was a presence, whatever that means. I mean, but as far as a ghost, no. I thought about it, but again, we were downstairs, so. But I certainly felt a presence. Again, for all these reasons we're talking about, all the objects, all the intimacy of the house, the so much that feels so alive still.
Mhm.
Jenny?
After we completed the writer in residency studio apartment, the first person we asked to stay there was Mariel Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway's granddaughter, Jack Hemingway's daughter. She had never known her grandfather. She was born some months after he died. And she is a very attuned, thoughtful person. And she described feeling just a great sense of warmth and welcoming there. I feel like for myself, there are many times there that there is something elemental that occurs, a gust of wind that closes the door, a sudden rain shower. And I would echo Richard that I think just the persistence of the babbling of the river. Hemingway came to Idaho. I don't want to make nature sound like a utopia here. I mean, it's a beautiful natural landscape. And I think it certainly functioned as a salve, as a consolation, a solace for Hemingway. But it was also a place of struggle, and he sought that struggle, right? He sought it when he went out hunting or went for long, long walks up Trail Creek Road. And, so I think paying attention to nature, giving yourself that space, and not only in a pastoral, idyllic sense, but in all of the senses of nature is a way to feel Hemingway's presence.
I guess I will note that we interviewed a number of people who spent time in that house, and at least the people we talked to, none of them felt an evil or an onerous presence. If anything, they felt kind of inspired and welcome, and an invitation to be creative. And Naomi McDougall Jones does tell a very fascinating, and it was too long to get into for our show, but I would like to get back to it someday. Probably as close to a real ghost story as you're likely to hear. So it's possible that there might be something there, but it's not. Everybody explained it or representative as a positive experience, not a negative one. So we are coming up on our hour, and it's been a great conversation, and we aren't going to be able to get to all the questions we've been asked, but I wanted to end with this one from Leaf, and I think it's a great question for us to to cogitate on 100 years after Hemingway began writing and 60 years after his death. This question is, how are next generation millennials and Gen Z readers connecting with Hemingway, through school or otherwise? But I think here's the point I want you to focus on. How does his writing connect with us today? Why does this writer and this man and this mystique and everything that goes with it, why does it remain relevant today? And Stacy, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Richard, and we'll finish with Jenny.
I think the most important reason why he is still relevant today is because he held the mirror up to us to see ourselves, and he didn't blink, and he didn't pull anything back. And so we see the rawness of our existence. And the other thing I thought about has to do with the iceberg theory, in a sense that about his characters, is that on sometimes, for instance, the women characters, you have one impression, and then when you really start digging into what's beneath that iceberg, you find all these richness to these characters. And I see that as a way to look at the folks around us. Like, you see this person and you judge them for whatever it is, or try not to, but then it's this whole iceberg underneath them that exists. And Hemingway teaches us to dig underneath the characters. And I think that transfers into us thinking about, this is the way I need to, kind of think about how I judge people, or what I think, but I think maybe not, maybe is more to it. Maybe I do feel more than I see. and why. So that's what I think about why it's still relevant, is along with all the other reasons that we read Hemingway.
Thanks. Richard?
Yeah, I think I'll sort of following up on Stacy. I think that that's part of why it's continuing to be relative in the way that the poetic quality or value of the work, that you can go back to a poem. I still go back to poems that I've been reading 20 years and learn something different. That his work is operating on so many layers, precisely because of that spareness, right? That we keep on, we seemingly spare, right? But there's a lot going on, and I think everybody can come to the page, no matter what generation, and pick up something or go back to the page, as Stacey was saying, and learn something new. But like a poet, a mirror is the perfect thing. Again, to pull in Elizabeth Bishop, also said, a poem is a mirror to the reader, basically, right? It's a mirror to oneself, but ultimately it's a mirror to the reader. And then the other thing that I think in our context, now that I'm thinking about all these connections and objects and what Stacey was saying, and community in Idaho and all, and Sagan and Moreau, and he was also an example of how we need community to write and live, but especially for our writers. And I actually bring up Hemingway very specifically in my writing classes. It's like, I think he says something to the effect, you got to have something to write about. Right? Like, live life first, and then again go away and find time to write. But also that life is not just the material; it's also community that supports our lives, that lets us wade through life as human beings and as writers and figuring it out. And I think he's a great model of that, of holding community, believing in community, and having that giving back to community, and how all that sort of comes full circle for him. And I think as an artist himself, it's a model, kind of a model to follow still.
Well, in the film, Richard, Ginny actually describes the house and Idaho as kind of a refuge and sanctuary for Hemingway. And so very much what you're describing, a community and a space where he felt, safe when he was not well, and as a place where he could create as an artist. So Ginny, your thoughts on that question, how does it remain relevant and important today?
I think Hemingway's work remains and will long remain influential and compelling because of how Hemingway, in the midst of his getting immersed in and immersing his stories in landscapes of war, of bullfights, of violence and dramatic adventure, ultimately the transcendent moments is he finds redemption in unexpected places. So it might be Nick Adams opening a can or holding a fish. It might be in The Sun Also Rises, not with the running of the bulls or in the bullfighting arena, but when the protagonist is leaving a church and you only know that he's touched the holy water because he refers to his fingers, the dryness evaporating, the wet evaporating in the air. I mean, it's these ephemeral moments. And I think there can be a lot of cynicism. There is certainly a lot of struggle in Hemingway's novels and in his stories. And then there are these moments where you find redemption, and it is so fleeting and yet so possible, because it's not in the bullfighting arena. It's on the dirt road. It's in a simple place. And I think that's why we read literature, is to understand the struggle to be human, and how we find meaning. And he leads us to those moments where we can find a moment of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you guys were terrific, and we could go on for another hour, and I would love to, but we're not going to poach any more of our audience's time. So, before we wrap up, I want to thank Mindy Pepper and Troy Shreve at Idaho Public TV and Martha Williams at the Community Library for helping us, behind the scenes put this event on. I also want to thank Idaho Central Credit Union and Perpetua Resources, who supported the broadcast of Idaho's Hemingway, this episode of Idaho Experience. If you want to see it, you can stream it at idahoptv.org. You can see Richard Blanco reading his Hemingway-inspired poem. Find the link there. You can also get a tour of the Hemingway house from Jenny Emery Davidson and her friend Mary, linking at that same place. So if you're inspired to find out more, go to our website. There's lots of resources there for you to find out more. Obviously, the last thing we want to remind you is April 5th, 6th, and 7th will be the 6-hour Ernest Hemingway documentary by Ken Burns. It plays twice at 7 and at 9 o'clock those 3 nights. So we hope we have given you an appetite for more about Hemingway. And lastly, I just want to thank Jenny and Richard and Stacy for a really inspiring conversation. And thank you so much. So be well.
Thank you all. What a pleasure.
Thank you.
You bet.
It's wonderful.
Thanks for joining us. Good night, everybody.